The work that I presented today is part of an ongoing interest that I've had on questions about Muslim identity, Muslim politics, and the wider politics of multiculturalism, race, identity, nation, and so on and so forth. The work is about Kenan Malik's book, From Fatwa to Jihad, but that's in the context of a larger concern that I've had with freedom of speech controversies. And Malik's book is one of the major sort of interventions from a liberal point of view on freedom of speech controversies, and it's had an enormous impact because it's been one of the best-selling books about the Rushdie affair and its aftermath and so on. So that's really the context of where I'm coming from with this. Well, I'm a literary critic, so although Malik's work is not a work of literature in the narrowest sense, and although these issues are often seen as sort of part of sociology or political philosophy or so on and so forth, I'm kind of interested in public rhetoric, in the way in which people talk about issues, and specifically the way they use certain ways of talking about those issues. Certain metaphors, certain ways of making it into stories or narratives that I think have really important effects, not least because they work unconsciously on people who listen to or read these works. And it's a way of kind of organising the material to make a kind of meaning that's socially effective. And I think that's the value that, as a literary critic, you're very attuned to looking for really at detail, at language, and the way that language is used. And from my disciplinary background, I think there's a contribution you can make to public debate about ways in which people talk about race, identity, culture, religion, and so on, just as opposed to what they talk about, So that's as important in its own way. The main questions that I'm asking are really a kind of critique of liberalism and liberal thought as a dominant way of kind of arguing against certain ways of being in contemporary Britain and contemporary Europe. They focus on Muslims, because my research is focusing on Muslim-related freedom of speech controversies. But also they're sort of more generalizable outside of the Muslim context, because, these questions about whether freedom of speech should be restricted for hate speech and all of those sorts of things are not just particular to Muslims and so on. So my concern is with liberal thought there, and a critique of liberal thought, and some of its fundamental premises, which I find to be kind of almost culturally supremacist in its own way, are unaware of its own cultural dominance and unable to concede that there might be other ways of being in the world. They sort of kind of make everybody subscribe to liberalism first before they actually say, well, okay, then you can be different. So it's a kind of superficial difference that they kind of accommodate. My main takeaway message is this, that the crisis of multiculturalism, if it can be called that, or the failure of multiculturalism or whatever, is a kind of rhetorical device. It's a way of expressing a certain anxiety within liberal thought about forms of politics, forms of identity, forms of being, ways of being that are not particularly accommodatable or not particularly hospitable towards liberal perspectives. We need to think about these things at a deeper level, because beyond the rhetoric of this crisis of failure is actually a kind of understanding that everybody else has to kind of subscribe to these dominant values before they can be considered as equal citizens or equal participants in the debate.